I said before that definitions of war are inherently politicized. For example, the Holocaust, which killed 6 million Jews and several million others, is almost universally regarded as a crime against humanity. The Nazis regarded this final solution, as they called it, as the central element in what they regarded as a state sponsored campaign of systematic extermination, essentially a war. In a July 1943 speech to SS officers, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler all but said so outright. I'm going to quote here. We have the moral right, we have the duty to our people to kill this people who would kill us, he told the assembled officers. And to have seen this through, to have remained decent, has made us hard and is a page of glory never mentioned and never to be mentioned. Never mentioned or to be mentioned because the Nazis expected the final solution to remain a permanent state secret. Here's another example. This security camera footage at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, on August 4th, 2019, shows a 21-year-old shooter who drove for hours to reach that particular Walmart in the well-founded belief that most of its customers would be Hispanic. He killed 20 people and wounded 26. Before committing the act, he placed on the internet a manifesto that framed his action as an act of war on behalf of what he viewed as a white race in danger of being overwhelmed by non-whites. He viewed himself as one soldier in a larger conflict, saying that he had been inspired by another self-appointed fighter, a white supremacist, who 5 months previously had attacked two mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, killing 51 worshippers and wounding another 40. The man had posted his own manifesto online. Both men were adherents to a white supremacist theory called the Great Replacement, which postulates an intentional conspiracy to replace white majority populations in the United States, France, and elsewhere with non whites through policies that encourage mass migration and a low white birth weight. Is this an example of war? The two male shooters clearly viewed themselves as combatants in a war, but there's another angle. While both shooters were criminally indicted for murder and attempted murder, their acts have been likened to terrorism, as what we're looking at in this image here, because of their explicitly political motivation. In this respect, they are similar to self-radicalized individuals who committed mass murder in the name of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, shown in action here. Now, let me back up. To give you an idea of what ISIS is like, this photo shows an ISIS mass execution in progress. For a time, the terrorist group controlled a large expanse of Iraq and Syria. Their rise tracked back directly to the US invasion of Iraq, which created a power vacuum in the region that ISIS thought to exploit. Among the self-radicalized terrorists was the shooter who in June 2016 killed 49 people and wounded 53 more at a predominantly gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Just before the attack, he proclaimed his allegiance to ISIS. Now, it isn't clear whether that was his real motivation. He was both mentally ill and homophobic. But ISIS sympathizers reacted by praising the attack on pro-ISIS state forums. To give one further example of self-radicalized terrorism, on July 14th, 2016, a Tunisian man drove a truck at high speed into a French crowd celebrating Bastille Day, the French equivalent of the 4th of July. The attack killed 86 people and wounded 458. The man was killed by police, so it could not be determined for sure whether he was self-radicalized, but investigation showed no known affiliations with terrorist organizations. ISIS did not formally take credit for the attack, but an ISIS news agency termed the man, quote, a soldier of the Islamic State. Finally, let's examine one further event that suggests how definitions of war are inherently politicized and also the difficulty of defining what war is and what war is not. I refer to the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. You already know what happened. And because it's such a recent event in American political life, it offers a vivid example of the way in which definitions of war are inherently politicized. I don't mean to suggest that this event was an example of war, but Democrats have tended to call the event by a name that pushes it in the direction of war, an insurrection, they call it, while Republicans have tended not to avoid giving it any particular characterization that might settle for riot. Certainly, they have used a kind of whataboutism that equates what happened at the Capitol with the riots that broke out at some Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. Now, if you're offended by the very idea that the storming of the Capitol has any place in a history of war course, you're getting the point. So too, if you feel delighted by its inclusion. Either way, you're accepting the idea that definitions of war are inherently politicized. But stepping back from politics and trying to view things objectively, what should one call the storming of the Capitol? The answer is difficult because the event belongs in what might be called the borderlands of war. Now, what do I mean by borderlands? Most of the world's political borders have an artificiality to them. You will find people on both sides of any given border who speak the language of the other country, who share folkways, cuisines, and who engage in extensive economic interaction. For that reason, it makes much more sense to speak of a borderland rather than a neatly articulated frontier. One reason the El Paso shooter targeted that city is that it was itself part of a larger borderland community. And you're looking at this larger community here. Population of El Paso is 80% Hispanic. Just across the Rio Grande from El Paso is the city of Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And just to the west is the city of Las Cruces, New Mexico. These three cities interact so extensively that they are often considered to be a single metropolitan area called variously Paso del Norte or the Borderplex. The area has a population of 2.7 million and has the largest bilingual, binational workforce in the Western Hemisphere. So when we think of war conceptually, it's useful to think metaphorically of the borderlands of war, types of violence that may not be war, but have features in common with war. And the storming of the U.S. Capitol has two features that point it in the direction of war. First, the objective of those who stormed the U.S. Capitol that day was explicitly political. Second, those who played a proportionately or disproportionately large role in the event were paramilitary groups that had planned to storm the Capitol and wore combat attire and used military-type communication methods to coordinate their attack and who employed military tactics. With regard to the political objective, January 6th was the date when Congress would certify the result of the 2020 presidential election. The thousands of supporters of President Donald J. Trump who came to a rally in Washington that day were convinced that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen, that Trump remained the rightful U.S. president, and for that reason, they sought to prevent the certification of Joe Biden's election as the 46th president of the United States. Now, this was a mere constitutional formality, but Trump's supporters had been told by Trump himself that Vice President Mike Pence, who would preside over the certification, could refuse to do so and could refuse successfully if enough members of Congress backed him up. Now, this was the overriding theme of President Trump's speech at the rally, which he concluded by telling the thousands of supporters in attendance, quote, "We're going to walk down to the Capitol. We're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. We're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong." Now, President Trump didn't walk back to the Capitol. We know that he wanted to go to the Capitol, but the Secret Service prohibited him from doing so. Instead, he went back to the White House. But well over 1,000 supporters did march down to the U.S. Capitol, and hundreds attacked the U.S. Capitol Police, ultimately breaking through the police cordon and entering the Capitol itself, many of them telling the overwhelmed police officers, "Trump sent us." Among the crowd were members of at least 5 paramilitary organizations that had come to Washington intent upon storming the Capitol, most notably the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. The Oath Keepers are shown here. And this gets at the second commonality between what happened on January 6th and war. Organized military action. Of the hundreds of Trump supporters who engaged in fighting with the police and entered the Capitol, most had not come to the rally with the intention of storming the U.S. Capitol, but some clearly did. There were groups of Proud Boys who were in front of the U.S. Capitol, who were near the police cordon as early as 10:30 in the morning before Trump's rally even began. And among these, in addition to the Proud Boys, was a paramilitary group called the Oath Keepers, who pre-planned the storming and conducted it as a military operation. The Oath Keepers consisted of former law enforcement officers and military veterans who understood military planning, communication, and tactics. They coordinated their operation with cell phones and walkie-talkies and used a military tactic tailor-made to break into the Capitol. The tactic is called stacking, and it calls for a tactical team to line up on a door or corner in very close proximity, with one man right behind the next. At left, you see U.S. paratroopers using the stack formation as they practice entering a building occupied by the enemy. At right, you see Oath Keepers using the stack formation as they move up the Capitol steps toward one of the entrances, and that's highlighted by the red ellipse that shows the Oath Keepers in that stacking formation. Now, to repeat, the Oath Keepers were among at least 5 paramilitary groups known to have been present at the storming of the Capitol. These were essentially the spearhead that breached the Capitol entrances and enabled other Trump supporters to get inside. A member of the Oath Keepers paramilitary group, who was charged with conspiracy in connection with the Capitol riot, claimed to be coordinating with the Proud Boys and the far-right self-styled militia called the Three Percenters to form what he called an alliance on January 6th. The crowd fought through a barricade manned by U.S. Capitol Police, entered the Capitol at 1:30 p.m. For almost 3 hours, they roamed its halls and entered both the House and Senate chambers and vandalized offices. At 4:17 p.m., President Trump uploaded a video telling his supporters who had breached the Capitol, quote, "I know your pain. I know you're hurt. We had an election that was stolen from us. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace. We have to have law and order. This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to go home. We have to have peace. We love you. You're very special. I know how you feel, but go home and go home in peace." Around 5:40 p.m., a contingent of National Guardsmen arrived to assist the Capitol Police and Washington Metropolitan Police in clearing the building, which was pronounced secure finally at 7:30 p.m. In the weeks afterward, the FBI conducted a major investigation to identify the persons who had entered the Capitol. As of mid-August 2021, 570 people allegedly involved in the event had been arrested, and 400 people were facing conspiracy charges by federal prosecutors. But what exactly had they done? Or to put it another way, what are we to call the storming of the Capitol on January 6th? I have purposely used the term storming because it conveys a sense of the violence involved, but does not specifically define what occurred. Was it a riot, which under federal law is essentially a tumultuous disturbance of the public peace by three or more persons assembled together and acting with a common intent? Or was it an insurrection, a term swiftly and widely used by the media? The Department of Defense Dictionary of Military Terms does not define insurrection per se, or for that matter, riot, notwithstanding the fact that the National Guard, a component of the American Armed Forces, is charged with controlling riots. And the dictionary does not define riot control agent, basically tear gas, either. Nor is insurrection defined in U.S. law code, although it recognizes the concept. The federal law states whoever incites, sets on foot, assists, or engages in any rebellion or insurrection against the authority of the United States or the laws thereof, or gives aid or comfort thereto, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years or both, and shall be incapable of holding an office under the United States. Now, it's interesting that most legal efforts believe that as a practical matter, it would be nearly impossible to actually convict someone under this statute. And indeed, for the most part, federal prosecutors have charged participants with what might roughly be called criminal trespass and disorderly conduct. Insurrection, however, has a well-known ordinary meaning. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines the word as, quote, an act or instance of revolting against civil authority or an established government. This comes reasonably close to the Department of Defense definition of insurgency. Quote, the organized use of subversion and violence by a group or movement that seeks to overthrow or force change in a governing authority. The hundreds of Trump supporters who entered the Capitol did so with the intent of preventing the certification of Joe Biden's election as president, which, if successful, would have very definitely forced change in a governing authority. And as we've seen, paramilitary organizations like the Oath Keepers came to the Capitol wearing military gear and using military tactics to breach the Capitol. So, to that extent, we have an organized use of violence. I would nonetheless argue that the storming of the Capitol was not an act of insurgency, although these paramilitary groups view themselves as prepared to conduct an insurgency. But it wasn't a riot either. Perhaps one could call it an organized riot, but that's not a very satisfactory answer. If by now you're not at all sure how to define war, then I've done my job. I think that war essentially defies definition. It is too complex. It takes too many forms. It is too politically charged. What one group regards as war, another regards as terrorism, while another regards it as criminal activity. And this photo underscores my point. After 9/11, this political complexity, what war is, what it isn't, is it terror? Was 9/11 terrorism? Was it criminal activity? This ambiguity tied the U.S. government in knots. And to sidestep the issue, it invented the category of, quote, illegal enemy combatant. Illegal denied enemy combatants the status of prisoners of war, but combatant implied that they were not mere criminals and were therefore not subject to due process, in which federal prosecutors would have to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, which would have required the disclosure of military intelligence or other sensitive information. As for the Al Qaeda members most closely involved with the 9/11 attack, the Bush administration was particularly intent to avoid treating them either as combatants or as criminals. It needed, as an attorney advisor to the US State Department put it, the legal equivalent of outer space. It found this in Guantanamo Bay Prison, which is controlled by the US military but located in Cuba, where it was argued constitutional legal protections did not apply. Now, I maintain that war defies definition, but I'm in a distinct minority. Most military theorists and historians have come up with very neat and clear definitions of war. The best known of these is the one given by the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz. In his famous treatise On War, published in 1832, he wrote, "War is a continuation of policy by other means." In German, the word Politik can stand for either politics or policy. So it is also accurate to translate the definition as war is a continuation of politics by other means. And if you squint really hard and want to see it badly enough, this definition would seemingly be a perfect fit for the storming of the Capitol. But Clausewitz was a Prussian general who fought during the Napoleonic Wars. And although he framed his definition in universal terms, and too many military historians uncritically accept this, essentially, he was thinking about conventional wars between two or more countries. As for policy by other means, he meant that countries normally attempt to get what they want through diplomatic negotiation. But when they cannot get what they want this way, they may turn to violence as an additional tool of negotiation, as additional leverage. Clausewitz doesn't make this clear. The idea is better expressed by Thomas Schelling, one of the best known American strategic analysts of the 20th century. The power to hurt, he once wrote, is bargaining power. To exploit it is diplomacy. vicious diplomacy, but diplomacy. I would argue, and in fact have argued, that war is a form of negotiation, not just at the strategic level, but at the tactical level as well. I made this point in a film column I wrote about the harrowing 20-minute scene of the desperate fight for control of Omaha Beach that opens director Steven Spielberg's superb film, Saving Private Ryan. The column, by the way, is one of your required readings for this week.